The night the blizzard consumed Sweetwater County, Wyoming, the temperature had already fallen 30 degrees in less than an hour. That kind of cold had a name among the old-timers of the Green River Range. They called it a killing cold. Clyde Stewart, a widower ranching alone near Burnt Fork, had not heard a human voice in 11 days. No one traveled in weather like that. Not in January of 1909, not on the high Wyoming range, where storms off the Uinta Crest could bury a man before he reached his own barn door. And then, through the howl of the wind and the groan of frozen timber, came something no man living alone on that range could have prepared for. A knock, 3 strikes, deliberate. Someone was at his door. The winter of 1909 arrived in southwestern Wyoming, the way all serious winters arrived on the frontier, without negotiation and without apology. By late January, the snowpack along the Green River Basin had climbed past the fence posts. The sage was buried. The cattle trails had vanished beneath a surface so uniform and white, the distance lost all meaning in the flat afternoon light. The land had become a silence so complete that a man working outside could lose his sense of direction within 50 feet of his own barn door. This was not extraordinary. This was Wyoming in winter. What was extraordinary was everything that came after. To understand what happened on the night that knock came, you have to understand who Clyde Stewart was and what kind of life he had built in Sweetwater County. He was a Colorado man by origin, having grown up on a farm outside Boulder. He had come to Wyoming with a particular determination that the frontier seemed to attract and then slowly, methodically test. He had filed his homestead claim under the terms of the Homestead Act of 1862, which granted 160 acres of public land to any adult who improved and worked it for 5 years. He had built his cabin from log and timber with his own hands, in the way that men on the frontier built the things they needed, not because they had learned the trade, but because the land did not offer the alternative of waiting for someone else to do it. He had fenced what could be fenced, run cattle on ground that rewarded patience and punished arrogance, and made of himself the kind of rancher that southwestern Wyoming recognized and respected. A man who knew the country, kept his word, and did not ask the land for more than it could reasonably give. He had married once. His wife had died. After her death, he reorganized himself around the loss with the efficiency of a man who understood that the land does not stop demanding its daily attention because a man's heart has broken. He kept working. He kept the cattle. He kept the cabin maintained and the fences sound and the wood stacked high. And for some time after, he moved through his days with a competence that looked from the outside exactly like contentment and was, from the inside, something considerably more complicated and considerably more quiet in the way that sustained loneliness is quiet, which is to say completely. The cabin he occupied was not elegant by the standards of any civilization that valued elegance. It was functional in the way frontier structures were always functional, built to keep the cold out, hold the heat in, and outlast the particular violence that Wyoming winters applied to anything made by human hands. The walls were thick log. The roof was sound. The fireplace drew well enough to keep the interior from freezing during the worst nights, which on the high Green River Range could mean temperatures dropping to 30 or 40 degrees below zero. He had seen it. He had prepared for it. The memory of the long winter of 1880 to 1881, which had buried the Dakotas and Wyoming and Nebraska under snow from October through May, stopping the trains for months and leaving entire communities surviving on ground wheat and frozen turnips, with men using picks in the spring to dig down through 20 feet of packed snow to the buried steel rails, had been pressed into the regional memory with a permanence that shaped how every serious rancher stocked his cellar and cut his firewood. Clyde stacked his wood high. He salted his meat in October. He did not trust the sky between November and April, and he had never had cause to regret that distrust. But preparation on the American frontier was always a conversation with uncertainty, never a contract against it. You could do everything correctly, and the land would still find the angle you had not anticipated. That winter, the angle Clyde had not anticipated was the kind of solitude that accumulates over days without any human voice to interrupt it. Not the ordinary quiet of a working man who prefers his own company, which he was accustomed to and had made a kind of peace with. What gathered around him over those 11 days in January was something with more weight to it, a silence that the cabin walls held in rather than kept out, a quality of absence that grew more pronounced. With each morning, he rose to do the same rounds in the same order, with no one to report them to and no one waiting when he returned. The evening the knock came, he had completed his rounds. He had broken the ice on the water trough twice through the day, because the cold had been refreezing the surface within hours of each clearing. He had checked the cattle in the barn and made his mental notes about what the season was costing him in feed and in the slow attrition of animals pushed hard by the cold. He had split enough wood to see the next 24 hours through. He had come inside before the light went completely and pulled the door against a wind that was building with the deliberate menace of a full storm gathering its forces over the mountains to the southwest. He set water to heat on the iron stove and lit the oil lamp on the table by the window. Outside, the wind was no longer the ordinary complaint of a Wyoming evening. It had become something larger and more serious. The temperature was falling in the way it fell when a real storm had committed itself. He could feel it in the walls. He could hear it in the sound the timbers made, a low, compressed creaking, as if the cabin itself was acknowledging what was coming and bracing accordingly. He knew what a storm like this meant. He knew nothing living and without shelter would survive the night on the open range. He was still at the stove when he heard it. At first, he did not separate the sound from the noise of the wind, because a blizzard against a cabin wall produces 100 sounds, and a man alone long enough begins to hear shapes in the white noise that are not there. He waited. He listened. The wind screamed across the roof and dropped suddenly in one of those brief, inexplicable pauses that big storms produce. And in that pause, the sound came again. 3 knocks, close together, with clear intention behind them, not the random percussion of ice or branch. A hand against his door. He crossed the floor in 4 steps. He drew back the latch and pulled. The door swung inward, and the cold came in like a physical wall, hitting him across the face and chest and pulling the warmth from the room in a single instant. And standing in that doorway, against the white chaos of the blizzard behind her, was a woman. She was covered in snow from her hat to the hem of her coat. Her face was red from the cold, and her lips were pale. She held a traveling case in her right hand, and the wind behind her was furious and entirely indifferent to them both. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Later, when he would try to describe that moment, he would say only that the world had arranged itself into something he had not expected and could not yet name. She said her name was Eleanor. She had come from the stage road. She had seen the light in his window. She was very cold. He stepped back from the doorway. He said, "Come in." And that was how it began. What Clyde Stewart could not have known in that moment was that the woman stepping out of that blizzard was not a stranger in the way he understood the word. She had answered his advertisement. In the fall of 1908, after recognizing that the ranch had grown larger than one set of hands could properly manage, he had placed a notice in the Denver Post. A few plain lines seeking a reliable woman with household experience to help manage the homestead in exchange for wages and accommodation. He had not expected much. He had not expected her. Eleanor Pruitt was a widow who had worked in Denver as a laundress and then in domestic service, and she had decided that the city was not where she intended to remain. She wanted land. She wanted open country. She wanted the specific freedom that people in Denver discussed theoretically and almost never pursued in practice. When she saw his advertisement, she wrote back the same day. Through some coincidence of weather and road and the timing of her arrival, the stage had let her off at the last passable point, and she had walked the remaining distance into the building storm. She had reached his door not on a calm spring afternoon, but in conditions the old-timers on the Green River Range would later say were among the hardest of that particular January. She came inside. He closed the door against the blizzard. The lamp burned between them on the table. For the first time in 11 days, the cabin held 2 voices. He poured coffee and set it in front of her. She held the cup in both hands without speaking for a long time, and he did not press her because the frontier had taught him that a person coming in from that kind of cold needed to return to herself in her own order. He asked if she was hungry. She said she was. He cooked what he had: salt pork and beans from the stores he had put up in the fall, the kind of meal January on a closed frontier produced. She ate without complaint and with the appetite of someone who had been traveling hard since before dawn. He watched her and recognized in the act of watching a quality of attention he had not exercised in a very long time. He looked away when she looked up and found a reason to busy himself at the stove. The blizzard outside was reaching its full height. The cabin walls held the sound of it, that particular howl the Wyoming wind achieved when it had committed itself completely to a direction and an intensity, and was no longer varying either. Inside, the stove held, the lamp held, and two people sat across a table from each other in yellow light, while the worst storm of the season raged beyond the walls, and neither of them yet understood what the land had set in motion. The morning after the blizzard had its own particular quality on the Wyoming range. The wind dropped before dawn and left behind a silence so complete it pressed against the ears like deep water pressing against the chest. Snow had piled against the north wall of the cabin to the level of the window sills. The door, when Clyde tried to open it at first light, met a resistance of compacted drift that required a shovel to clear before he could step outside at all. The thermometer on the outside post read 31 degrees below zero. He had seen worse. He went to his morning work in the way men on the frontier went to their morning work, without ceremony, without complaint, methodically, in the right order, because the order mattered and the cattle did not wait. When he returned to the cabin an hour later, stamping snow from his boots at the threshold, he found that Eleanor had been busy. The fire was built high. The coffee was fresh and hot. On the table there was cornbread she had made from the supplies in his kitchen, working with the ease of someone accustomed to unfamiliar spaces and making them functional without requiring direction. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and coffee and fresh bread. It was the first time in many months that he had come in from the morning barn work to find food already made, and the simple fact of it registered in him with a weight that surprised him, the way simple things sometimes surprise men who have been alone too long. He sat down. He ate. He did not make a ceremony of gratitude because the frontier was not a place where ceremonies were made over ordinary things, and she had already established, in less than 12 hours, that she was not a woman who required them. She ate across the table from him, and they talked in the plain way of two people establishing what their shared situation required. She produced his letter from her coat pocket and placed it on the table, his own words, written in his careful hand, offering wages and accommodation in exchange for household management. She placed beside it a letter of recommendation from her former employer in Denver, a widowed schoolteacher named Mrs. Juliet Coney, who had written of Eleanor with a warmth and specificity that made him read the page twice. He asked what she had brought. She listed it plainly: her traveling case, her clothing, a sewing kit, 3 books, needles and thread. He asked about family in Wyoming. She said she had none. She had been a widow for several years. Her first husband had died in a railroad accident in Oklahoma. She had supported herself entirely since, first in a laundry and then in domestic service. She had decided that the city offered her a ceiling she was not willing to accept. The frontier was not the intimidating thing that Denver assumed it to be. She intended to file a homestead claim of her own on the adjoining land, in addition to the work she had come to do, because she believed a determined woman could homestead successfully on the Wyoming range, and she intended to prove it. He listened with the attention of a man who has learned that listening carefully is more useful than responding quickly. He asked if she understood what Wyoming winter actually was. She said she had a general idea. He said a general idea was different from the specific reality. She nodded in the way of someone who agreed while reserving final judgment until the evidence arrived. He respected that posture. It was precisely the posture the frontier required of anyone who intended to last in it. They established the terms of the arrangement in the direct language the situation called for. She would manage the household, the cooking, the domestic provisioning the ranch required. She would receive wages and her own room. She would have freedom to pursue her homestead claim when the season permitted. He would respect her independence. She would respect the rhythms of the ranch work. It was a business arrangement of the kind the frontier regularly produced, clear in its stated terms and considerably more complex in everything that lay beneath them. What lay beneath them was this: two people who had each, in their different ways, been remade by loss and rebuilt themselves with the materials available. Clyde had kept working after his wife died. He had placed his advertisement not from what he would have called loneliness. The frontier did not encourage that kind of language about oneself, but from the practical recognition that the ranch required more than one person could manage. That was his honest understanding of what he needed. It was a correct understanding as far as it went. But there is something the frontier does that the histories of the period sometimes record and sometimes overlook. The land, which is so efficient at stripping away everything unnecessary, is equally efficient at making visible what remains. When Eleanor came into that cabin, she came into a space that had been stripped of a particular quality by years of solitary habitation. Not stripped of function, not stripped of competence, but stripped of the warmth that a specific human presence brings to a space, and that no amount of practical management can substitute. She did not simply bring help, she brought a weight to the room. He noticed it within hours of her arrival, and did not know what to do with what he noticed. And so he did what the frontier taught men to do with the things they could not yet manage. He went to work. She, for her part, was precisely as practical as she had presented herself to be. She worked hard from the first day without drama and without waiting to be told what to do. She learned where things were kept and reorganized what needed reorganizing without asking permission. She had strong opinions about how a household should run and express them when they diverged from current practice, without apology but without aggression. A distinction that required some calibration on his part, but that he ultimately found, after the first week, genuinely valuable. A person who said what they meant was a person you could depend on in the way the frontier required dependence, completely, without ambiguity, in conditions where ambiguity was its own kind of danger. February on the high range was relentless. The Sweetwater County of 1909 had its own geography of cold, the way the wind came down from the Uinta Mountains, the way the Green River Valley funneled the air in certain conditions, the way snow fell differently at different elevations. He knew this geography the way he knew the barn floor in darkness, by feel, by long acquaintance, by the kind of knowledge that is not in books because it cannot be put there. She learned it with the patient attention of a person who understands that the land will teach her what she needs to know if she is willing to pay the cost of sustained attention, which she was. They worked alongside each other through February and into the early weeks of March. They talked in the evenings when the day's work was done and the lamp was lit and the stove held its warmth against the dark outside. He had a bagpipe, a fact she had not anticipated, and played it in his room after supper, a sound that came through the cabin walls with a particular melancholy she found, after the first startled week, oddly right for the landscape and the season. He played the same tune often enough that she could hum it accurately by the end of the first month. Something was happening in those weeks, something that neither of them named, because naming it would have required a directness that was not available to two people in their position, in that period, in that place. But it was happening in the small accumulated evidence of days, in the way he listened when she spoke, in the way she noticed when something troubled him before he mentioned it, in the growing ease with which they moved around each other in the small space of the cabin. The land was at work on them both, gone, and what remained, when it had finished clearing away what was not essential, was two people who had each separately given up on a particular kind of future and found it again, by accident, by weather, by a newspaper advertisement placed without expectation and answered the same day. The question of what either of them would do about it had not yet been answered. The land had one more card to play first. He noticed the small things first, the way a man notices things he has no framework yet for interpreting. He noticed that she read with complete absorption, in the way of people who learned to read as children, before they had other entertainments available, and for whom the habit had become constitutional. She read in the evenings at the table while the lamp burned, and he worked on whatever needed mending or sharpening. And occasionally she would read something aloud without preamble, simply because it seemed to her worth saying out loud. And he would listen and offer a response, and they would talk for a few minutes about whatever she had read, and then return to their separate occupations. He had not had that kind of evening in a very long time. He had not known he missed it. She noticed things too, though she noted them in the letters she wrote to Mrs. Coney in Denver, rather than in anything she said aloud. She wrote about the quality of the light on the range in the early morning. She wrote about the way he moved through the barn work, not hurried, not slow, but with a particular economy of motion that spoke of long practice. She wrote about the sound of the bagpipe through the cabin wall and how the landscape seemed to have been waiting for exactly that sound. She did not write, in those early letters, about anything she could not yet name. February deepened, and the cold became simply the condition of existence. They learned each other's rhythms through the accumulation of days, the 1,000 small observations that form, in time, a knowledge the person who holds it cannot put into words. The land had one more card to play. The thing about the Wyoming high country in early March is that it lies. The days grow longer, and the light takes on a quality that looks like spring and contains none of it. The temperature climbs above zero in the afternoons and falls back through the nights to places that qualify as deep winter anywhere else. The snow softens on the south-facing slopes and refreezes after dark into something that moves like water when the warming comes again and behaves exactly like a trap. The ranchers who had spent enough winters on the Green River Range to read its moods accurately did not trust the March light. They watched the sky to the northwest with the attention of people who know what arrives from that direction when the atmosphere makes certain arrangements. Clyde watched the sky on the morning of the second week of March and did not like what he saw. The cloud building over the Uinta crest had the flat-bottomed, compressed quality of a system carrying more moisture than the air could comfortably hold. He told Eleanor this at breakfast. She looked at it and agreed. She had been in Wyoming long enough by then to have begun acquiring her own vocabulary of the sky, because in that country the sky was not background but active participant. He told her he needed to ride to the upper pasture to check the cattle before the weather closed in. She said she understood. He left before 8. The clouds continued to build through the late morning, descending over the ridgeline with the slow inevitability of something that has made up its mind. The temperature, which had climbed above freezing for the first time in weeks, began falling again by noon. The storm came faster than the approach had suggested it would. That was the specific deceit of March in the Wyoming mountains. The system could look slow and give you time you did not have. The snow that started in the early afternoon was the heavy, dense kind, with serious moisture behind it. It fell straight at first, and then the wind came, and the curtains of snow became walls. And by mid-afternoon, the cabin windows were opaque with driven white, and the world outside had ceased to be visible. He had not come back. This was not immediately alarming. He was capable on familiar ground. But as the afternoon wore on and the storm reached its full intensity, his expected hour of return came and passed. And Eleanor found herself trying to calibrate genuine concern against working knowledge. She knew the country less well than he did, but she knew enough. She knew that in a whiteout on the upper range, even a man who had ridden that ground 1,000 times was navigating by the spatial memory of his horse, rather than by sight. She knew the cold was serious. She knew that the disastrous winter of 1886 to 1887, which had driven temperatures so low across Wyoming and Montana that cattle died by the tens of thousands on the open range, and their carcasses clogged the rivers when the spring thaw finally came, had taught the entire territory what happened when you underestimated the late-season storms. That lesson was operational information on the Burnt Fork Range. It was told and retold among the people who worked that country and intended to go on working it. She built the fire higher. She kept the lamp burning in the window, the frontier's oldest signal, not decoration, but navigation. A fixed point of light in a landscape that offered none. She kept the meal warm on the back of the stove. She sat by the window that showed her nothing but white darkness, and she waited. She was not a woman who catastrophized. She had learned that catastrophizing used resources better deployed in paying attention. So she paid attention. She listened to the storm, tended the fire, watched the lamp, and waited. He came back 2 hours after dark. He came through the door the way a man comes through a door when he has been a long time in serious cold, closing it first, before speaking, because the first instinct on reaching shelter is to secure it. His coat was crusted with ice to the collar. His face, when he turned toward the lamp, had the specific redness of skin that has been in high wind cold for hours past what is comfortable. She was already at the stove. She poured coffee and set it on the table and went to the supply shelf where she had put aside, weeks earlier, a preparation she had made from tallow and dried herbs, a treatment for the cracked, weather-damaged hands that were his most consistent winter injury. She brought it now and set it beside the coffee without comment. He sat. He drank. After a time, he spoke. He told her that one of the cattle on the upper pasture had gone down in the storm, and he had spent most of the afternoon working to get it back on its feet. And when that proved impossible, dealing with what the situation required in the way the frontier required it to be dealt with. He had been caught farther from the barn than was comfortable when the storm came in fast, and the horse had kept him oriented through the whiteout in the way that horses on familiar ground will do when a man's own directional sense has been taken by the snow. He reported all of this in the flat, economical language of a man stating facts. The frontier produced men who reported their experiences of the weather and moved on. What she noticed, watching him across the table in the lamplight, was that he was exhausted in a particular way, not the tiredness of physical labor. He was exhausted in the way of a person who has spent hours in genuine proximity to danger and come out of it intact, but with the reserves fully used. She recognized that specific quality of exhaustion because she had her own version of it, earned on the stage road through the January mud on her way to Wyoming, when the distance between herself and any shelter had felt like something she was carrying rather than covering. The exhaustion of effort applied to real opposition and sustained past the point of comfort. She did not remark on it directly. What she did was remain at the table after the meal, which was unusual. Their evenings had settled into a pattern over the weeks. Supper, conversation, and then each of them to their own work. She generally withdrew to write the long, honest letters to Mrs. Coney in Denver that she had been maintaining since her arrival, and that had already accumulated into a substantial record of her first Wyoming winter. He generally went to his room and his bagpipe. That night, she stayed. She picked up her sewing. He refilled the coffee, and they talked past the hour when the lamp normally went out. Not about the cattle or the weather or the practical machinery of the ranch. He told her about his first wife, simply without performance, in the way a man speaks when he has decided his audience can be trusted with the actual version of a thing. She told him about Oklahoma, about Denver, about what it had meant to her to decide that the life she had been living was not the life she intended to finish, about the precise moment she had seen his advertisement and understood, without lengthy deliberation, that it was the answer to a question she had been forming for a long time. He asked what she had thought during those hours walking through the January blizzard from the stage road, what had been in her mind as the storm drove sideways across the high plain, and his lamp was the only fixed point in the white. She thought about it for a moment. Then she answered plainly. She had looked at the light and fixed on it and walked toward it. She had not allowed herself to think about anything else. Not the cold, not the distance, not the wind, only the light and the next step and the step after that. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he had placed that lamp in the window when the storm started because it seemed the right thing to do. He had not known who might need it. He had simply put the light there. Neither of them spoke further for a while. The fire settled in the stove. The wind outside had dropped in the way it sometimes did past midnight, as if even the Wyoming winter needed occasional rest. The ranch held its stillness around them. What had been building through all those weeks made itself fully visible in that quiet, not through any declaration or gesture. The frontier was not the setting for those kinds of things. What became visible was simpler and more lasting. A mutual recognition, clear and without confusion, that what had been happening in this cabin through the long winter was not going to stop. That the land had been working on them both with its particular efficiency since the night she knocked and he opened the door, and had arrived at its conclusion ahead of either of them. In May of 1909, Eleanor filed her homestead claim on the land adjacent to Clyde's, exactly as she had always planned. And in May of 1909, she and Clyde Stewart were married. 6 weeks after she had arrived at his door in a blizzard, guided to it by a light he had placed in the window for no one in particular, and for exactly her. She wrote about all of it to Mrs. Coney. She wrote about the cold and the storms, the long evenings, and the bagpipe through the wall. She wrote about filing her own claim and proving that a woman could work the Wyoming frontier on her own terms. In a letter from the spring of 1909, when the range was coming green and the snow was gone from all but the highest peaks, she wrote one sentence that held more than any explanation she might have constructed. She wrote, "There is a kind of knowing that the ordinary world does not often permit, but that the open country and the cold and two people in the same small space for the same long winter makes available plainly for anyone willing to look at it directly." It was enough. Eleanor Pruitt Stewart died in October 1933 in Rock Springs, Wyoming. Clyde survived her by 15 years. He is buried beside her in Burnt Fork Cemetery, Sweetwater County, the same county where, in January of 1909, a storm buried the roads and the sage, and a woman walked through it alone, guided to a cabin door by a light that a widower had placed in the window for no one in particular, and for exactly her. If this story stayed with you the way a Wyoming winter stays with the people who live through it, quietly, permanently, in ways that do not ask permission, do something before you leave. Comment below and tell us what part of this story hit hardest. Subscribe to this channel so the next story finds you the way that lamp in the window found Eleanor, without you having to search for it. If this video meant something to you, leave a like. The frontier rewarded the people who showed up. Show up here. We will keep the light on.